A single line of ash whispers through a forgotten journal. An ancient house haunted by secrets no fire could erase, and a mind teetering on the edge of memory and madness. Somewhere in the darkness, a truth burns brighter than the flames that seek to destroy it. Shadows linger, and the boundaries between sanity and suspicion blur with every stolen breath. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. The mystery begins now. The evening in question was marked by that peculiar breed of London drizzle which, though seldom heavy enough to drive one indoors, permeates coat, mind, and bone alike. Baker Street, glistening faintly beneath the gas lamps, seemed to retreat into itself, its foot traffic reduced to an occasional hansom cab or a shadow moving purposefully through the gloom. Within the sanctum of 221B, I sat in a rare state of repose, medical journals strewn about my knees, the fire burning low, and Holmes, my singular friend, seated across from me, immersed in the kind of reverie which is both a symptom and a warning of some impending intellectual storm. His long, angular form was sprawled in the armchair, eyes half shut but flickering with a light I'd come to associate with the anticipation of a puzzle worthy of his mettle. The clock chimed 8:30, and all in our world, at least for the moment, was as still as the grave. It was precisely at such times, I have found, that fate most delights in her little disruptions. A brisk rapping at the door caused Mrs. Hudson to shuffle up the stairs, muffled in her shawl, to admit a boy from the telegraph office. He bore, not the expected telegram or letter, but rather a small, soot-blackened envelope, one so thoroughly smudged that the handwriting upon it was barely legible. He insisted upon placing it directly into Holmes's hands, and departed with a nervous backward glance, as though the weight of his errand still pressed upon his shoulders. The envelope itself was unremarkable in size, but stained at its edges with what could only be described as the residue of some long-dead fire. Holmes regarded it in silence for a moment before carefully breaking the seal. It was addressed in a trembling, feminine hand, to Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Within the envelope was a battered scrap of a journal, half of its pages reduced to curled, blackened remnants, the paper brittle, as if it might dissolve at the touch. There was but one complete sentence remaining, inscribed in a hurried scrawl, as though the writer's very life depended upon the words surviving the flames. She lied, and now the silence will kill them both. A chill swept the room as Holmes laid the fragment upon the table, smoothing it with a gentleness that belied his apparent detachment. He gestured for me to examine it, and I could not help but feel an involuntary shudder as I read the brief, ominous line. There was no signature, no explanation, and no clue as to whom the accusatory words referred, yet the note exuded a quiet urgency which seemed to vibrate in the stillness of our sitting room. Holmes leaned in, his keen eyes alight with the glint of the hunter who has scented quarry in the wind. Without a word, Holmes reached for his glass and began a minute inspection of the envelope, the paper, and the ashes that clung stubbornly to the folds. He held the paper to the lamplight, scrutinizing the watermark. "It is from a stationer in Chichester," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "Note the grade and cut, Watson. Only a certain class of customer would bother with such paper. The soot here is not that of common coal, but rather of a resinous wood, perhaps cedar, which burns at a lower temperature and is less common in London households. This suggests a rural origin, likely a house with an old library or study where such woods are still burned." He paused to study the handwriting. A woman's hand, but the tremor is not merely of age or illness. See how the pressure falters. This is fear, not frailty. And the envelope itself, delivered by hand in haste by someone unwilling to trust it to the post. I surmised that the sender was a young woman, educated, possessed of some literary turn, and in grave distress. The soot on her fingers transferred here, and the rush in her script speaks of danger as immediate as the fire that half consumed this page. He spoke these words softly, but with a certainty that made the hair prickle at the back of my neck. The sender risked much to see this message reach me. There is more at stake here than the words alone suggest. My own heart grew heavy with each detail Holmes supplied, as if a shadow had fallen across the familiar landscape of Baker Street. It is one thing to marvel at Holmes's deductions in the abstract, quite another to feel them close about one's own soul like the tightening of a noose. "And what, pray, do you infer from this grim warning, Holmes?" I ventured, my voice lower than I intended. He did not immediately reply. Instead, he sat back in his chair, steepling his long fingers beneath his chin, his gaze fixed on the curling edge of the burned journal. "Watson," he said at last, "we are in the presence of a silent cry for help, one written not merely in ink, but in terror and desperation. I believe the sender may already be beyond our reach, or soon will be. This is not the harbinger of a crime yet to be committed, but the echo of one already set in motion." His words settled upon me like a weight. In that moment, I understood with chilling clarity that our quiet evening had been well and truly broken. The shadow of an unknown peril had entered our lives, and Holmes, with that terrible lucidity of his, was already preparing to follow it into darkness. The night yielded slowly to a cheerless dawn, and Holmes and I found ourselves at our modest breakfast, the events of the previous evening still casting a contemplative silence over our table. Holmes, who abhorred unnecessary conversation at such hours, was immersed in the study of the charred journal fragment, while I nursed my tea and the peculiar sense of foreboding that had crept into my thoughts. It was thus that the bell rang, a hesitant, uncertain summons, startling us both from our reflections. Mrs. Hudson entered, her voice low. "A young lady to see you, sir." And in came a figure whose appearance struck me as singularly pitiable. She was slight, her features refined but drawn with fatigue and something more, an inward distress of a kind seldom seen save in those burdened by a secret or sorrow. Her gloved hands trembled as she removed them, and though she sought to compose herself, her eyes betrayed a haunted vigilance. "My name is Lydia Winterbourne," she began, her voice scarcely above a whisper, "and I have come to beg your assistance, Mr. Holmes. I fear there is something terrible afoot at Emberwood Hall." Holmes rose to greet her, offering no immediate assurance, but his gaze was already alert, measuring, weighing. I watched as he motioned her to a chair, the warmth of his manner doing little to diminish the intensity of his scrutiny. The room seemed to contract about her, as if Baker Street itself understood that the fragile peace of our morning had, in that moment, been irrevocably shattered. Miss Winterbourne's first words, once the formalities were out of the way, fell with the leaden gravity of confession. "There was a fire, sir, scarcely a fortnight past. Not a great conflagration, but enough to blacken half the east wing and destroy the old library. The flames were contained swiftly, yet since that night, a heaviness has descended upon the house. It is as though something that had lain dormant for years has been awakened." She spoke not of the physical devastation, but of the unease that followed. "I cannot say why, but I feel watched, sometimes even followed in my own home. The servants whisper, the old house creaks with new and troubling voices, and at times I have woken to find my hands smeared with soot, though I have not gone near the ruined rooms." Holmes nodded, encouraging her to continue, though I saw he had already noted the faint blackness beneath her fingernails, a subtle detail she herself may have missed. For myself, I was deeply moved by her evident sincerity. "I have come," she continued, "because I no longer trust my own judgment. The fire may have burned the wood, but it has not lifted the shadows." There was a pause. a moment in which Miss Winterbourne gathered herself, as if bracing for a confession. My mother, you may know, was Marion Winterbourne, the poetess. I recalled the name. In my youth, her slender volumes had been much admired for their delicacy and melancholy, and her tragic end had been the subject of much idle speculation in literary circles. She died when I was a child. There were whispers of madness, of voices only she could hear. My father would not speak of it, and since his own death, the house has seemed to settle into a silence so profound that even memory is muffled. But now, since the fire, I sometimes think I hear her voice in the night, her words, not in my memory, but in the very air itself. It is as if her shadow remains, restless and wounded. The fragility of Miss Winterbourne's composure was plain, but Holmes's countenance remained unchanged. He leaned forward slightly. You say the household still bears your mother's shadow. In what manner? There are old servants who claim to hear her footsteps. Even our dog will bark at empty doorways. And the villagers say Emberwood is cursed. Her confession left the room feeling colder. The distance between us and that isolated Sussex estate abruptly narrowed by the reach of the past. After a moment's silence, Miss Winterbourne produced several folded scraps from her reticule, their edges scorched, the ink blurred by both heat and haste. There is something else. These notes have begun to appear, tucked within my books and papers. At first I thought them merely remnants salvaged from the fire, but their contents... Mr. Holmes, they quote verses my mother never published, private lines from her journals, lines that only she and I ever saw, and which were kept locked in the old library. Yet here they are, copied in a hand not her own, sometimes accompanied by threats or cryptic warnings. Holmes took the scraps from her, scanning them with a mixture of curiosity and calculated detachment. The heart's true wound lies not in flesh, but in what the silence keeps. He read aloud from one, his brow furrowing. Miss Winterbourne's composure trembled. You see, sir, someone knows what they should not. Someone is playing with memories that are not theirs to touch. It was clear now that the threat she faced was more than physical. There was malice here, a design to unmoor her from reason, to twist grief into madness. Holmes placed the fragments and the scorched journal side by side, examining them in silence. You say these notes have come only since the fire. Yes, Mr. Holmes. They appear as if conjured from the very ashes. He regarded her for a moment, then spoke with measured gravity. Miss Winterbourne, it is my belief that the fire, though destructive, served as a catalyst for something long planned. Someone in your household or close to it has access not only to your mother's lost writings, but also to the means of instilling doubt and dread in your mind. The correspondence between these notes and the burnt journal is no coincidence. Rather, it is the deliberate work of a mind intent on manipulating memory, perhaps even to the point of driving you to question your own sanity. He paused, and I saw in his gaze the faintest flicker of sympathy, rare in Holmes, but unmistakable. Rest assured, we shall look into the matter at once. Holmes rose, the decision made with characteristic abruptness. Watson, be so good as to pack for a journey. Miss Winterbourne, I ask that you return directly to Emberwood Hall and inform no one of your visit here. We shall follow within the hour. There is no time to lose. I hastened to gather my things, heart pounding with a sense of imminent adventure and foreboding in equal measure. Holmes, as he drew his cloak about him, offered a final reassuring glance to our visitor. Have courage, Miss Winterbourne. The shadows of Emberwood may be deep, but they are not impenetrable. And thus, before the morning sun had fully broken through the mist, we set out, drawn inexorably toward the enigma that awaited us amidst the ashes and memories of Emberwood Hall. The journey to Sussex proved sombre, the landscape cloaked in the ashen pall of late autumn. When we arrived at Emberwood Hall, its sombre facade appeared to rise from the earth itself, the once grand stonework stained by years of wind and recent fire. The sky overhead pressed low and grey, and as we passed beneath the arching elms toward the main entrance, I felt a heaviness settle upon my heart. Holmes was, as ever, unmoved by atmosphere, but I could not help but observe the subtle way his gaze travelled from window to window, noting every detail: the scorch marks climbing the east wing, the boarded panes, the sag in the wrought iron gates. Upon entering, we were greeted by a hush so profound that even our footfalls seemed a trespass. Lydia, now in her own domain, appeared a shade less fragile, but anxiety yet haunted her countenance. A brief introduction to the household awaited us, but already I sensed that Emberwood Hall was a place where secrets nested in every shadow and silence. Our first encounter was with Mr. Basil Winterbourne, Lydia's uncle, and the nominal master of the house. A man of indeterminate age and stoic bearing, he greeted us without warmth, yet with a civility born of habit rather than welcome. His eyes, cold and appraising, flickered momentarily over Holmes, before settling on Lydia with a mixture of exasperation and concern. Nell, the servant girl, was summoned next, a slight creature with pale hair and downcast eyes. She curtsied without raising her gaze and seemed to melt into the background as soon as propriety allowed. Holmes's questions, gentle yet piercing, elicited little more than monosyllables, but the tension in her shoulders did not escape my notice. Finally, we met Mr. Dredger, the tutor. His countenance was stern and severe, with sharp features and a manner as brittle as frosted glass. He spoke little, answering Holmes's polite inquiries with clipped precision, but I detected a certain disdain, as though our presence was an affront to his carefully ordered world. All three wore their secrets plainly, though the nature of those secrets remained as yet obscured. Holmes, for his part, seemed content to observe rather than interrogate, his attention lingering on the subtleties of posture, gesture, and tone. It was the library that drew Holmes first, a place transformed from sanctuary to ruin. The fire had licked hungrily at the shelves, leaving behind a blackened hearth and shelves of warped, half-consumed books. Holmes moved through the wreckage with care, pausing before the hearth where the worst of the damage appeared concentrated. He knelt to study the pattern of the burns, his fingers trailing over soot-blackened bricks. Notice, Watson, how the flames devoured this particular section, and yet the stones above remained strangely untouched. This was not a fire of happenstance, but of intention. He pressed gently upon one stone, which gave slightly under his hand. With a deft movement, Holmes dislodged it, revealing the faint outline of a hidden compartment, long sealed by smoke and time. Though its contents had been removed, or perhaps never placed there, the discovery lent a new dimension to our suspicions. "There is a mind at work here, Watson, one accustomed to both secrecy and subterfuge," Holmes remarked, his voice soft as he restored the stone to its resting place. I felt the weight of his words keenly, for it seemed now that every inch of Emberwood Hall was haunted not by ghosts, but by the calculations of some hidden adversary. As Holmes and I accompanied Lydia through the upstairs corridors, the family hound, an old mottled creature, trailed us with uneasy whimpers. It was only when we approached Lydia's bedchamber that the animal's demeanour changed abruptly. He stopped, hackles raised, and issued a low, insistent growl at the closed door, though there was no sound nor shadow within. Holmes knelt, extending a hand for the dog to scent. "Animals are often more attuned to what lingers unseen than we are," he mused. "Note how he reacts not to your presence, Miss Winterbourne, but to something which perhaps we ourselves cannot yet perceive." We entered the chamber and found nothing amiss save the subtle, persistent scent of smoke, old, yet not entirely faded. Holmes's eyes were intent. It is not the presence of a person, but the presence of memory, of some persistent trace that agitates the animal. There is more to this than simple superstition. His words left an impression, and I began to suspect that even the house's loyal beast was a participant in the unseen drama unfolding around us. It was on our second morning that Holmes drew my attention to a curious phenomenon. Each day, a fine layer of soot appeared anew in the corridor outside Lydia's room, always in the same pattern, faint but unmistakable. He marked the doorframe quietly with a line of chalk, an experiment as unassuming as it was telling. "Observe, Watson," he said that evening. "There is no fireplace nearby, nor any draught which could account for this residue. Its source is neither natural nor accidental. Someone wishes to remind Miss Winterbourne, perhaps all of us, that the fire, and all it represents, has not yet burned itself out." Holmes's vigilance was matched by my own growing unease. The soot was not merely an inconvenience, but a message inscribed daily by an invisible hand. Lydia herself, when questioned, admitted to finding it upon her windowsill, her pillow, even, on one occasion, beneath her nails upon waking. "There is a deliberate mind behind this," Holmes murmured, "one who seeks to erode reason through the slow, steady drip of suggestion." Our investigations next took us to the old nursery, now abandoned save for dust and memory. Holmes, guided by an instinct I had long since ceased to question, tapped along the floorboards until he discovered one that yielded to his touch. Beneath it, hidden within a hollow space, lay a single scorched page, its edges blackened, but the centre intact. Holmes extracted it with care, eyes narrowing as he scanned its surface. "See here, Watson, this is no random scrap. These are symbols, codes, perhaps, arranged in a deliberate pattern. Someone has gone to great lengths to hide not only their identity, but their intentions." I took the page from him, noting the faint impression of a woman's handwriting interwoven with a cipher. "Another voice, another secret," I remarked. Holmes nodded, "And perhaps, at last, a clue that will speak plainly if only we listen with the right ears." That evening, as the household retreated to their rooms, Holmes set himself to the task of deciphering the message. He worked in utter silence, his concentration absolute, while I kept watch for any sign of disturbance. Slowly, methodically, he translated fragments, phrases that spoke of regret, of love betrayed, of a secret kept at terrible cost. But the meaning remained elusive, as if the voice on the page had been severed mid-sentence by the very flames that had sought to destroy it. "I believe," Holmes said at last, his tone contemplative, "that what we have found is but a portion of a larger confession, one scattered throughout this house, woven into its very structure. The question, Watson, is not only who penned it, but who feared it might one day be found." His words trailed off, but their implication lingered in my mind, as persistent and haunting as the soot upon the doorframe. I understood then that the true nature of our case lay not merely in uncovering a crime, but in unravelling the web of memory and motive that bound each soul at Emberwood Hall. I found my sleep increasingly restless during those haunted nights at Emberwood Hall, my thoughts troubled by the accumulation of subtle, inexplicable events. It was in the grey hour before dawn, when even the bravest heart is made uneasy, that I was roused by a faint shuffling in the corridor. Taking up my candle, I slipped from my room and beheld Lydia herself gliding, pale and barefoot, through the passage, her eyes wide and unseeing. She moved with an eerie grace, as one possessed or caught in the clutches of some forgotten memory. I called softly to her, but she did not answer. Instead, she drifted to the charred threshold of the old library, her hands trailing along the blackened walls. With gentle insistence, I guided her back to her chamber, and only then did I notice the fine black dust clinging to her fingers. a residue unmistakably like soot, though there had been no fire nor candle in her keeping that night. Lydia, awakened, was bewildered and distressed, unable to recall how she had come by her stains or her midnight wandering. The incident left me deeply troubled, for it seemed to me that she was being driven by forces unseen, perhaps even beyond her own comprehension. When I confided the matter to Holmes at breakfast, he listened with grave attention but offered no immediate remedy, content instead to allow events to unravel further before committing himself to a theory. That afternoon the household assembled for tea in a strained semblance of normalcy. Conversation faltered, with every word weighed and found wanting in the oppressive atmosphere. I was seated beside Lydia when Holmes, with that effortless deftness peculiar to him, switched her cup with his own under the pretext of an errant biscuit. Lydia sipped absently, her gaze fixed on the sooty horizon beyond the window. It was not until later, as we conferred in the privacy of Holmes's temporary quarters, that he revealed the cause for his intervention. He produced a vial, into which he had poured the dregs of the cup originally intended for Lydia. Observe, Watson, a faint bitterness beyond the taste of ordinary tea. Chloral hydrate, in small but cumulative doses, sufficient to bring about confusion and deep, unremembered sleep. I was shocked, not least because such a substance, when administered surreptitiously, could easily mimic the early symptoms of madness. "You believe someone is attempting to break her mind?" I asked, scarcely daring to put voice to the horror. Holmes's response was measured. "I believe, my dear fellow, that someone wishes for others to believe precisely that." The sense of foreboding at Emberwood Hall deepened with every passing night, but it was Nell, the silent servant girl, who next disrupted the uneasy equilibrium. It was well past midnight when a commotion at the rear of the house drew Holmes and me out into the chill. Lydia, her nerves already frayed to the quick, clung to my arm, while Holmes led the search with calm efficiency. We found Nell stumbling through the edge of the woods, her nightdress torn and her hair streaming wild. She clutched a scrap of paper as if it were a talisman, her lips moving in soundless prayer. Once brought inside and given time to recover, she finally surrendered the torn page, a fragment of poetry, scrawled in the same distinctive hand as the anonymous notes that had tormented Lydia. The poor girl shook uncontrollably as Holmes questioned her, her eyes darting from face to face as if the walls themselves might be listening. It was clear that whatever secrets she harboured, she did so in mortal terror of their revelation. Under Holmes's patient, almost paternal questioning, Nell at last spoke of the voices that had haunted her rest. "It comes at night, sir, soft as breath. Sometimes a woman crying, sometimes only whispers, like wind through the boards. But lately, the voice is sharper. It says my name. It speaks of fires and secrets." Holmes pressed gently for detail, but Nell shook her head, fearful that to describe more would be to conjure the thing itself. "Sometimes I think it is Miss Marian returned. Sometimes I think it is someone else, hiding behind her voice." The girl's distress was genuine, and I was struck by the peculiar cruelty of a mind that would exploit such simple fear. Holmes, though outwardly untroubled, jotted a series of notes, and after ensuring Nell was cared for, turned his attention to the house itself. The suspicion had begun to take shape that what tormented Lydia and Nell alike was not a ghost, but a living presence, manipulating their every doubt. Holmes wasted no time in putting his theory to the test. Taking a lamp and a length of twine, he set about tracing the structure of the east corridor, tapping along the panels and inspecting the joinery with practiced expertise. Before long, he discovered what he sought, a cleverly disguised seam in the wainscoting, just outside Lydia's chamber. With deft hands, he pressed and pried until a section of the panelling yielded, revealing a narrow, dust-choked passage running the length of the wall. We entered the cramped space, its air stale with disuse, and found that it ended in a tiny alcove behind the headboard of Lydia's bed. An ideal vantage for eavesdropping or for whispering words intended to unsettle the mind. Holmes, his face set in grim satisfaction, explained, "Our adversary is not content with letters and poisoned tea. He seeks to become the very voice of madness, haunting Lydia in the one place she should be safest." This revelation filled me with horror and admiration in equal measure, for it was clear now that we faced not superstition, but a calculated campaign of psychological terror. As the days dragged on, the burden of these discoveries pressed ever more heavily upon me. Lydia, once delicate but composed, now drifted from room to room in a state of distraction. Her confidence and vivacity eroded by constant doubt. I watched helplessly as her hands trembled, her eyes darted to empty corners, and her voice became uncertain, haunted by memories not entirely her own. For the first time, I found myself fearing not merely for her safety, but for her very sanity, wondering whether the dreadful inheritance of her mother's fate might, through the machinations of another, become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Holmes, for his part, remained vigilant and resolute, but I saw in his moments of stillness a new gravity. The case was becoming more than an intellectual puzzle. It was a contest for a human soul, waged in shadows and silence. Yet even as dread grew within me, I clung to the conviction that Holmes would pierce the veil of deception, and that in so doing he might rescue not only Lydia, but the memory of her mother as well. The sombre hush that had settled over Emberwood Hall was shattered before dawn by a scream of such terror that it seemed to rend the very stones of the house. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest, and rushed through the dim corridors, Holmes at my side, his face as composed as ever, but his stride swift and purposeful. Servants scurried from their quarters, wide-eyed and shivering, as we converged upon the source of the commotion, the study. The door had been thrown open, and there, slumped in the chair by the fireplace, sat Mr. Basil Winterbourne, his head fallen at a grotesque angle, the last vestiges of life fled from his pale features. His skull bore the unmistakable imprint of a violent blow, and in his hand he clutched the remains of the scorched journal, its edges still faintly smouldering, as if reluctant to relinquish the secrets it held. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of burnt paper and the acrid undertone of tragedy. Lydia was nowhere to be seen. As Holmes bent to examine the scene, I could not shake the dreadful certainty that we had crossed a threshold beyond which all innocence had been lost. The silence in the room was oppressive, filled only by the frightened whimpers of Nell and the muffled sobs of a house undone by violence. The mystery deepened further when, moments later, Lydia was discovered standing in the adjoining corridor, her nightdress dishevelled and a dark smear of soot staining the hem. Her eyes were vacant, fixed on some point beyond the ken of the living, and when I spoke her name, she gave no answer, save a faint trembling of her lips. It was as though she were ensnared in a dream from which no voice could rouse her. Holmes, moving quietly to her side, examined her hands and found, as I feared, further traces of soot beneath her fingernails. Lydia seemed neither frightened nor aware, but only lost, adrift in a sea of confusion and horror. When at last she was gently led away by Mrs. Hudson and Nell, I felt a pang of pity so acute that it drove out all suspicion. If ever there was a soul manipulated by circumstance and cruelty, it was Lydia Winterbourne. Holmes watched her go, his eyes narrowed, as if searching for the faint thread of reason that might connect this new tragedy to the unseen hand behind it. No sooner had Lydia been removed to her chamber than a chorus of anxious whispers began to swirl among the servants. I caught snatches of old stories, the Winterbourne curse, the madness of Marian, and now this sudden grisly death. The household seemed poised on the edge of panic, each face etched with dread and suspicion. The arrival of the local constable did nothing to dispel the tension. He was a man of rigid manner and narrow mind, and after the briefest examination of the study and Lydia herself, he announced his suspicions with a certainty born of prejudice rather than proof. "There's madness in the blood, doctor, and murder often follows," he declared in a voice meant for all to hear. The accusation hung in the air, as heavy as the scent of burnt parchment. Lydia's heritage had become her albatross. Her mother's tragic reputation now resurrected to brand her as a pariah. It seemed to me that Emberwood Hall had become a crucible, testing the limits of both reason and compassion. I could not abide the injustice of it and spoke passionately in Lydia's defence, asserting her innocence with every fibre of my being. "You do her a great wrong," I insisted. "Miss Winterbourne is the victim here, not the perpetrator. I have seen her suffer these past days. No murderer ever bore such anguish as she." Holmes, meanwhile, maintained his composure, silent and watchful, his sharp eyes missing nothing. While I argued with the constable and pleaded with the household to hold their judgment, Holmes methodically surveyed the crime scene. The arrangement of the furniture, the position of the body, the faint traces of ash on the hearth. He was a figure of utter calm amid the tempest, his detachment a balm to my own rising agitation. Only once, as I finished my protestations, did Holmes glance at me with a look of silent encouragement, as if to remind me that emotion and logic, when rightly guided, could yet serve the cause of justice. As the initial tumult subsided, Holmes drew my attention to a detail easily overlooked in the chaos. The fireplace poker, resting innocently by the grate, was conspicuously clean, so clean in fact that it bore not the slightest trace of ash or blood, despite being the obvious instrument for such a blow. Holmes lifted it, examining its length with practiced care, then replaced it precisely as he had found it. "A weapon so spotless in a room so soiled is a paradox worth noting, Watson," he murmured. "Where there is too much cleanliness, there is often a concerted effort to deceive." With this subtle clue, Holmes planted in my mind the suspicion that the killer was both cunning and intimately acquainted with the workings of Emberwood Hall. As I gazed at the inert form of Basil Winterbourne, I understood that we were no longer searching merely for a motive, but for a mind shrouded in calculation and darkness. Thus the crime scene, in all its horror, yielded at last the faint glimmer of a lead, one that Holmes, with characteristic patience, would soon pursue to its bitter conclusion. The events of the previous night had left the household in a state of feverish unease, and Holmes, seizing upon this emotional turbulence, requested that all members of the house assemble in the ravaged library before the afternoon was out. Lydia, fragile yet composed, took her seat by the sooty hearth, her eyes never quite meeting those of her uncle's empty chair. Mr. Dredger appeared with a stiffness that suggested both disdain and apprehension, while Nell hovered at the threshold, twisting her apron in anxious hands. Holmes, with deliberate ceremony, placed the scorched journal at the centre of the long table and stood before it, his manner grave, but his gaze as penetrating as I had ever seen it. He addressed the gathering not as an accuser, but as a physician unveiling the cause of a persistent malady. "There are secrets within these walls," he began, his voice level, "secrets that have festered in silence and shadow, but which must now be drawn into the light." The room seemed to contract around us as we waited for his next words, each member of the household aware that Holmes's invitation was no mere courtesy, but the opening move in a game whose stakes had become life itself. Holmes opened the brittle journal with utmost care and, in a tone that brooked no interruption, began to read aloud from the deciphered passages. The words, once penned by Marion Winterbourne and rescued from the brink of oblivion, rang out with startling clarity in that ruined chamber. "Fire is the memory of the wounded heart. Ashes are its only heir." Holmes's selections were pointed, each one a veiled accusation or plea. Fragments that spoke of a love turned sour, of betrayal and obsession, of a legacy imperiled by the hands that claimed to guard it. Lydia's breath caught at certain lines, and I noticed that Dredger's knuckles whitened upon the arm of his chair. The journal tells us of a voice that would not be stilled, even by death, Holmes observed, his eyes travelling from one listener to the next. It tells us of the living, haunted by the unfinished business of the past. The air was taut with anticipation, the lines between victim and perpetrator blurring as the story of Emberwood's ghosts was laid bare for all to hear. Holmes set the journal aside and addressed us not as disparate individuals, but as conspirators in a mystery yet unresolved. Consider, if you will, the pattern of events, the soot, the whispers, the poisoned tea. These are not the workings of fate or madness, but of design. Someone within these walls feared the exposure of secrets so deeply that they resorted to terror, to manipulation, and finally, to murder. His words struck the room like a flint upon stone. Ask yourselves who stood to lose most if Marion Winterbourne's truths were brought to light. Who, among us, has knowledge of both the old poetess's writings and the means to sow doubt and confusion? Who would risk everything to erase a legacy they could not claim as their own? It was a masterful web Holmes spun, the logic inexorable, and the emotional pressure mounting with every carefully chosen word. A hush fell, broken only by Lydia's shuddering breath and the faint creak of Nell shifting in her chair, as each mind in the room circled ever closer to the inevitable revelation. It was at this juncture that the facade began to crumble. Mr. Dredger, who until now had maintained a front of icy detachment, began to show unmistakable signs of distress. His lips pressed thin, his eyes darted from Holmes to Lydia and back, and a faint sheen of perspiration appeared upon his brow. He uttered a weak protest. "This is monstrous, Holmes. You play upon old wounds and private grief." But the words rang hollow, their effect undercut by the tremor in his voice. Holmes fixed him with a gaze so intent that it seemed to pin the man in place. "Monstrous, perhaps, to bring to light what others have sought to bury, yet monstrous too, to manipulate the living with the fears of the dead." Dredger's composure faltered further. His hands shook, and he cast furtive glances at the door as if calculating an escape. The tension in the room became nearly unbearable. I could feel the entire household holding its collective breath, the last veil of secrecy stretched to its breaking point. At last, with a gasp more of exhaustion than defiance, Mr. Dredger broke. He rose from his chair, his dignity falling away, to reveal a figure shattered by guilt and longing. "Yes," he cried, his voice ragged. "It was I who loved her, Marion, the only woman whose mind ever matched my own. She rejected me, humiliated me, exposed my plagiarisms, and drove me from her heart. I swore to destroy every remnant of her, her work, her memory, even her child's peace, so that her voice would be silenced at last." He pointed a trembling finger at the scorched journal. "That book, those words, they tormented me. I could not bear for them to survive when I had been cast into darkness. It was I who poisoned Lydia's tea, who whispered in the night, who orchestrated the fire. And when Basil discovered too much, it was I who ended him, for he would not let the truth die." Dredger's confession tumbled forth, first in anger, then in tears. He collapsed to his knees, defeated by the very obsession that had driven him to such ruin. Lydia, pale and trembling, hid her face in her hands, while Holmes at last allowed a shadow of pity to cross his features. So ended the masquerade, the house of secrets laid open by the harsh light of reason and the frailty of human passion. The unmasking of Dredger brought with it an atmosphere both of catharsis and of quiet horror. Cornered by the relentless thread of Holmes's logic and the accusing eyes of all present, Dredger made no further effort to conceal the convulsions of emotion that racked his frame. With hands clenched and jaw trembling, he confessed in tones alternately pleading and bitter. Yes, I loved Marion Winterbourne, loved her as a starving man loves the memory of bread. But she would not have me. She mocked my advances, unveiled my forgeries, and cast me aside, leaving me to endure the hollow mockery of my own ambitions. You cannot imagine what it is, Mr. Holmes, to be scorned by the only mind that ever truly comprehended you. In my pain, I became a shadow in her house, watching as her child thrived where I had been banished. As Dredger's words tumbled forth, I saw in Lydia's face a mingling of pity and dread, for the depths of his obsession were laid bare for all to see, stripped of dignity by the light of his own confession. What followed was an account as chilling as it was pitiable. Dredger described how, in the year since Marion's death, he had devoted himself to the systematic erasure of her presence. He confessed to the burning of her private papers, the tampering with the contents of her library, and the careful crafting of anonymous notes designed to evoke terror in Lydia's soul. I wished to see her words consigned to oblivion, her influence erased from the world she had so cruelly denied me. The fire was my handiwork, the ashes, my tribute to a legacy I could neither claim nor destroy. The revelation that the torment Lydia had suffered was born of so intimate and twisted a grief sent a chill through all assembled. Even Holmes in his detachment could not hide the note of regret that crept into his tone as he pressed for further details. Dredger's efforts, though meticulous, had been ultimately futile, for the words he most longed to obliterate had proved themselves as enduring as the very ashes from which Holmes had reconstructed their meaning. The scope of Dredger's crimes became unmistakable as he confessed to the ultimate acts of cruelty, gaslighting Lydia, undermining her sanity with whispers in the night, and finally resorting to murder when Basil Winterbourne came too close to unveiling the truth. Yes, I killed him, Dredger declared, his composure collapsing into fevered agitation. He threatened to expose me, to tell Lydia of the lies and poison, to break the silence I had so carefully maintained. I could not bear it, for her mother's voice still echoed in this house. Even now, her verses haunt me, burning brighter than any fire I could kindle. I tried to silence her, but words are embers, Mr. Holmes. They live, they spread, and they consume. Dredger's confession was a thing of ruin and remorse, spiraling into a rant about the power of poetry, the tyranny of memory, and the futility of his vengeful campaign. It was a spectacle of human frailty, at once tragic and grotesque. At Holmes's signal, the authorities, summoned in anticipation of just such a confession, stepped forward to restrain Dredger, who made no resistance save a final, haunted protest against the ghosts of his own making. Lydia, at last exonerated, could scarcely stand. Her ordeal had left her pale as the moon, trembling with exhaustion and relief. She looked to Holmes, then to me, as if seeking confirmation that the nightmare had finally ended. I assured her, with as much warmth as I could muster, while Holmes merely nodded, his countenance marked by the sober satisfaction of justice served. The household, once so thick with suspicion and sorrow, now seemed emptied out. Its secrets spent, its illusions dispelled, but not without cost. As Nell led Lydia away to rest, I was left to contemplate the strange hush that falls in the wake of calamity, a hush punctuated only by the faint crackle of embers in the hearth and the footsteps of the constable escorting Dredger to his fate. In the stillness that followed, I found myself pondering the wounds inflicted by obsession and the scars left by grief. Justice, I reflected, is seldom an unalloyed blessing. It restores the innocent, punishes the guilty, yet leaves behind a residue of sorrow that no logic or verdict can fully erase. Holmes, too, seemed preoccupied, his eyes fixed on the dying fire, as if searching for a wisdom that would make sense of all the madness and loss we had witnessed. Thus ended our confrontation with the secrets of Emberwood Hall. Victory bought at a cost, and healing yet to begin. It was with profound relief that Holmes and I, after the terrible events at Emberwood Hall, found ourselves once more within the familiar embrace of Baker Street. The bustle of London, the kindly ministrations of Mrs. Hudson, and the homely clutter of our rooms restored a sense of order to my mind, which had grown sorely bruised by the ordeal. The fire burned bright in the grate, driving away the chill that seemed to cling to me still, and Holmes, seated in his accustomed armchair, was once more the master of his domain. It was in this sanctuary, and not among the haunted shadows of Sussex, that the full import of our adventure would be revealed. One evening, as I sat musing upon the recent tragedy, Holmes broke the silence. He spoke not with flourish or triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman laying out his finished work. Consider, Watson, the arrangement of clues, the soot which appeared and reappeared at Lydia's threshold, always fresh and never explained by natural cause. The listening tunnel, cunningly constructed to give voice to the past, the coded message beneath the nursery floor. Each, in isolation, might suggest the supernatural or the accidental, but together they form a deliberate pattern. He recounted how he had deduced the passageway's existence from Nell's confessions, the recurrence of soot from the evidence upon Lydia's own hands, and the true nature of the journal from its cryptic fragments. It was all meant, he concluded, to convince a young woman that she was succumbing to inherited madness, when in truth she was the quarry of a mind warped by envy and despair. Holmes's voice was neither boastful nor cold, but tempered by the knowledge that, even now, the wounds left by such schemes would not easily heal. "Let us not forget the tea," Holmes continued, his tone sharpening. The presence of chloral hydrate in Lydia's cup, and its absence in the others, betrayed a mind both ruthless and methodical. To engineer such an effect, to induce confusion and sleep while laying the groundwork for accusations of insanity, required both patience and intimate access. He paused, eyes half closed, recalling the scene of the crime. The murder of Basil Winterbourne was, in the end, the act that gave our adversary away. The fireplace poker, though the obvious weapon, bore not a trace of blood or ash, an impossibility in a house blackened by fire and violence. It had been washed, scrubbed with a diligence that bespoke guilt. No crime is perfect, Watson, and the very effort to erase all traces of it is what led me to its perpetrator. In this, as in so many cases, Holmes's genius lay not in the brilliance of individual deductions, but in his relentless refusal to accept the easy answer. Holmes turned to me then, with a rare warmth in his manner. "There are times, my dear Watson, when logic must be tempered with compassion and reason fortified by trust. Had you not remained steadfast in your belief in Lydia's innocence, had you not extended to her the simple kindness of faith, I fear even my methods might have failed." His words, unexpected as they were, moved me deeply. It had often seemed to me that my role in our adventures was merely to observe, to record, and to stand in awe of Holmes's prodigious intellect. Yet here, at last, he acknowledged the necessity of that which lies beyond the reach of logic, the steadfastness of the human heart. It is a lesson I have carried with me ever since, that in the pursuit of truth, one must not forget the solace and dignity owed to those who suffer. As our conversation drew to a close, Holmes grew pensive, gazing into the fire. "There is a deeper sorrow in this affair, Watson, which I confess troubles me more than even the violence we witnessed. Literature, once the sacred vessel of memory and solace, was here transformed into a weapon of malice. The written word, which can heal and inspire, was turned to the purposes of torment and destruction. Dredger's war was not with flesh, but with the legacy of a poetess he could neither possess nor forgive. He paused, the firelight flickering upon his austere features. There is a lesson here, perhaps, about the frailty of genius and the dangers of wounded pride. Yet I find myself mourning not only for the victims, but for the desecration of the very thing that ought to have ennobled them all. With these words, Holmes lapsed once more into silence, and I, for my part, found little to add. For I, too, felt the burden of all we had seen, the weight of sorrow, and the inextinguishable hope that one day words might again serve only the cause of truth. The days following our return to Baker Street were marked by a gentle quietude, the world outside muffled by the early onset of winter. Holmes and I sat frequently in companionable silence before the hearth, the ordeal of Emberwood Hall receding into memory, yet its aftershocks still vibrating in the quiet spaces between us. The fire's glow softened Holmes's sharp features and cast a reflective warmth over the room, a warmth that seemed to seep gradually into the spirit, driving back the last lingering chill of that haunted estate. I found myself studying Holmes anew, wondering at the resilience with which he bore the burdens of others, the sheer discipline with which he folded away the sorrows of each case once it was resolved. There was a peace in our rooms, a peace hard won, but not untroubled by the recollection of pain endured and mysteries unravelled. It was on such an evening, the logs hissing softly and the city's bustle distant, that I gave voice to a doubt that had long troubled me. "Holmes," I began, "do you believe madness to be the inescapable inheritance of blood, or is it rather the shadow cast by circumstance, by fear, by cruelty, by those who would wield another's history against them?" He regarded me thoughtfully, his gaze lingering on the flames as if he sought some answer in their flickering dance. Lydia feared her mother's fate more than she feared any living adversary. I confess I wonder sometimes whether it is not the suggestion of madness, the whisper, the doubt, that proves more dangerous than any defect of mind itself. It seemed to me that the very nature of evil, in this case, lay not in the extravagant gestures of violence, but in the quiet corrosion of hope and self-belief. That such wounds might be inflicted with words and insinuations was a revelation both sobering and profound. Holmes was silent for a time, and then, with characteristic lucidity, he offered his view. "The mind, Watson, is neither a mirror for the world nor a prison for the soul. It is a flame, capable of warming and illuminating, yet also of consuming, given the right fuel. Feed it with fear, and it will devour. Feed it with truth and resolve, and it may yet burn steady and bright." I was struck anew by the clarity of his reasoning, which held within it both the promise of healing and the warning of peril. "It is perhaps our greatest charge," Holmes continued, "to see that those in our care are not given over to the dark, but shown the possibility of light, even in the ashes of their sorrow." His words lingered with me, as many of Holmes's utterances did, growing more significant with each passing hour of reflection. Holmes, with a rare note of ceremony, drew from his desk the last surviving page of Marion Winterbourne's journal, rescued from fire, preserved now as a testament to endurance. He handed it to me, the ink faded but legible, the paper brittle yet unyielding. I read aloud the final line, its meaning shaped as much by context as by memory. "Truth lives longest in ash." There was a hush after I spoke, a silence into which the words seemed to echo and then settle, not as a pronouncement, but as a quiet benediction. Holmes nodded, satisfied. Her words outlived both her pain and her persecutor, Watson. Such is the peculiar immortality of the honest mind. I pressed the page gently between my fingers, aware that I was holding not merely evidence, but a fragment of spirit, reborn from destruction. Some days later, a letter arrived at Baker Street, the seal unfamiliar, but the hand instantly recognizable as Lydia's. She wrote from a quiet sanatorium in the country, her words composed yet tinged with gratitude and the first faint notes of hope. She described her convalescence with a frankness that bespoke both courage and relief. There were days of weariness, nights haunted still by dreams, yet an undercurrent of purpose had returned to her. I have begun, with the help of a kindly physician, to gather my mother's verses anew, she wrote. It is my wish that the world should read them as they were meant to be read, free from the shadows that once threatened to destroy them. Her letter closed with thanks to both Holmes and myself, not for having solved a mystery, but for having restored to her a sense of her own mind and her mother's rightful legacy. So it is that I bring this chronicle to its close, reflecting not merely on the solution of a crime, but on the subtler alchemy by which memory, art, and kindness transmute sorrow into strength. In the ashes of Emberwood Hall, something precious had indeed survived, a truth that no fire could erase and no malice could utterly extinguish. The world is seldom just, nor is the past easily escaped, yet I found comfort in the knowledge that healing is possible, and that the endurance of the honest word, like the honest heart, is a thing beyond calculation. Holmes sat beside me as I penned these final lines, his eyes steady and his mind already wandering to other puzzles. But I believe, in the depths of that winter, that even he understood. The greatest mysteries are those of the human soul, and the greatest triumphs, those of its renewal. Holmes sat quietly by the fire, his gaze fixed on the fragile scrap of ash-stained paper that had survived so much ruin. You see, Watson, he mused, truth endures not because it is loud, but because it persists, even in the faintest traces. Our greatest enemy was never madness, nor even malice, but the ease with which a lie, once kindled, can smoulder in the shadows for years. I nodded, reflecting on the lives so nearly undone by secrets and suggestion. But what do you think? Was there a single moment where everything could have changed? Or was the tragedy set in motion long before our arrival? I'm curious to hear your theories. Where do you believe the real turning point lay? If you enjoyed unravelling this mystery with us, share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more unforgettable cases, and don't hesitate to pass this story along to fellow lovers of classic detective tales. Until next time, the game is always afoot.